Good evening and welcome to the very first lecture of this academic year 2020-21. My name is Ruth von Bernus. I'm the director of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies, and I'm very happy to introduce you to Max Lazar, our graduate student who's currently the Goodman Fellow. This is a dissertation completion fellowship, and he's working on the dissertation on Jerusalem on the Main, which is about Frankfurt Jews between 1914 and 1938. Max is a well-known member of our center. And we are very happy to have you here tonight, Max. I want to mention one more thing about Max, because he developed and taught a course last semester confronting anti-Semitism, which was really well attended. And I think that's really a current topic we are currently dealing with. Max, thank you so much again for joining us tonight, for being the first speaker.
All right, great. Well, thanks so much for the warm introduction, Ruth. I'm really honored for the chance to be the person to kick off this fall series of events for the center. And I'm all the more grateful that people have shown up tonight, because this is a point in time during this year, and I think a lot of us are feeling kind of zoomed out. So I'm grateful that people would make the time after a busy workday on a Monday to show up for this talk. So without further ado, I'll share my screen and start my talk. Okay then. So in December of 1933, the Nazi Party member Gertrude Bengen wrote an angry letter to the editors of her local Nazi newspaper in Frankfurt. And in this letter, she complained about the fact that the city government had failed to rename her quiet street, which bore the name of the deceased Jewish banker and philanthropist Jakob Schiff. Bengen wrote that, quote, "Right now, the residents of our street are almost entirely National Socialist-minded people, and the swastika waves outside of every house. This Jakob Schiff always causes a sting, and if not to you, where else can someone direct this request? We'd all be very grateful for a revision," end quote. Bengen's letter was soon forwarded to different members of the city's government, and even made its way to the desk of the city's new Nazi mayor, Friedrich Krebs. And although Krebs tasked bureaucrats with developing a plan to Aryanize the names of streets that bore the names of Jews in Frankfurt, he soon balked for the local government not to rename Jakob Schiff-Strasse, or for that matter, to rename any streets named after Jews in the city. And Jewish street names wouldn't be a fixture of Frankfurt's physical landscape up until September of 1938. Now, in theory, this is something that should have been quite easy for the city to change. Working in tandem, the city's mayor, the Committee on Street Names, as well as the city's chief of police, essentially had the power to change any street name at will. So today I want to answer the following two questions in this talk. The first is, given the fact that the Nazi Party had already managed to roll back high levels of Jewish integration in political, economic, social, and cultural life right after they came to power in Germany in 1933, why did it take so long for Frankfurt to get rid of these Jewish street names? Second, how might looking at street names contribute to our historical and contemporary understanding of the dynamics of minority integration in Germany and around the world? Let me dial things back for a second, though, to take a look at the actual origins of Frankfurt's Jewish street names during the 19th century. So in the aftermath of the French Revolution, radical, liberal, and conservative rulers alike began to create new street names or to rename old ones in Europe. And according to the Israeli Oz Azar, this was part of broader efforts to use urban space to construct new political identities and to foster a sense of a shared collective past in different European societies during an era of nascent nationalisms. Jewish street names themselves started to appear in Frankfurt during the latter half of the 19th century, not long after the city's Jewish community was emancipated in 1866. The earliest known example that I've been able to find is of Heinestrasse, a street named after the German Jewish poet Heinrich Heine from 1872. While most of the initial Jewish street names celebrate the legacies of national cultural luminaries such as Heine or the composer Felix Mendelssohn, the city soon began to name streets after local Jewish notables. For example, in 1908, we have the creation of a street in honor of the Jewish philanthropist that you see pictured here, Charles Hallgarten. And what I really want to stress is the fact that the members of Frankfurt's city magistrate and city council at this point in time must have been acutely aware of the political significance of naming streets after Jews. In 1909, the city government agreed that street names would be used, quote, to preserve and strengthen local patriotism, end quote, and instructed urban planners to devise street names that would refer to, quote, local historical events, the names of persons intimately connected to the history of a given place, or serve as a memorial to German culture and German heritage, end quote. So this then was a way of pointing out past importance as well as the continued relevance of the local Jewish population for Frankfurt and for Germany. It was a conscious move by the city's government to strengthen and promote Jewish integration and belonging in the city. So after World War I, this same policy of using Jewish street names as a strategy for supporting both patriotism and integration continued into the early days of the Weimar Republic. I'm going to talk about a notable example of this from 1922, shortly after the assassination of Walter Rathenau, Germany's first Jewish foreign minister. It was in 1922, and on July 4th of that year, Karl Gerwien, who was a Social Democratic member of Frankfurt City Council, implored his colleagues to pass a resolution to rename a street or a square after Rathenau as a symbol of Frankfurt's unswerving support to the fledgling German Republic. And in that same speech, Gerwien stressed the fact that, quote, we do not wish to name a street after Rathenau in a remote district that will not be connected with public transportation for quite some time, but rather a street in a busy part of the city, end quote. The city council, the mayor, the city magistrate, and the chief of police soon reached an agreement to rename a central square in the heart of the city after Rathenau. And I want to talk a little bit more about the actual location of this square, which I have a picture of over here on the left of the slide at present day. The statue that you are seeing in the foreground of this photograph is of Goethe. For those not familiar with him, this is Germany's national poet, sort of the equivalent of Shakespeare for Germans, as well as a local son of Frankfurt. And the reason that you're seeing this statue here is because of the fact that Goetheplatz and Rathenau-Platz are directly adjacent to one another. So spatially then, the way that this square was renamed for Rathenau was done in a way that put forward these two figures, both the Jewish politician Rathenau and the non-Jewish poet Goethe, as equally important markers of German culture and identity. I'll add that based on the placement of the statue right here, we can see that the older Goethe is in fact staring with approbation upon the square that is renamed for the slain foreign minister. So in regards to the other Jewish street names in Frankfurt, this is a map of where these other streets were located as of 1932. In 1914, there were at least 24 in the city, and this number had doubled to 48 by 1932. Some added context about their location. They're not really located in neighborhoods that have a high density of Jews in their population. Moreover, they are spread around older and newer districts of the city. So incorporated into older, more historic parts of Frankfurt, as well as newer districts that would have actually been created over the course of the Weimar Republic. So when the Nazis first came to power in 1933, they wasted very little time in trying to imprint their own ideology onto the physical landscape of the city. Some early changes including a decision to rename a park ring as well as a bridge after Adolf Hitler, the big man himself. But in that same period in 1933, only 3 Jewish street names were actually changed, and only 2 of these were actually located in prominent locations. One of these, unfortunately, was Rathenau-Platz, which was changed to be named after Horst Wessel, who was a slain member of the SA, a Nazi paramilitary group. The second major street that was changed was a large boulevard that was named after the Rothschild banking family, which had its origins in the Jewish ghetto in Frankfurt at the end of the 18th century, start of the 19th century. But again, aside from these small changes, 45 other Jewish street names remained in place, and they did not actually come into focus until this earlier letter that I mentioned from Gertrude Bengen in December of 1933. And as I was saying before, this letter made the rounds in the city government, and the mayor decided to convene the members of the city's committee on street names, most of whose members had actually served on this same body during the Weimar Republic. So this was the creation of a somewhat ironic situation in which bureaucrats that had actually been responsible for creating Jewish street names during the 1920s and early 1930s were now potentially responsible for getting rid of Jewish street names under this new regime. That being said, though, this group on the committee soon had two very clear arguments for why they thought it would be a bad decision to rename Jakob Schiff-Strasse as well as other Jewish street names in Frankfurt. The first was the fact that Schiff and many other Jews had made large philanthropic donations to municipal and charitable institutions, including most prominently the University of Frankfurt, which was founded in 1914. The city was still very much cash-strapped after the Great Depression, and officials were worried that they might have a legal obligation to return donations if they were to rename streets that bore the name of philanthropists such as Schiff. A second reason, though, and this is also connected to this first reason, is that they worried that by renaming streets, they would create a fresh round of negative coverage of Germany in the foreign press, because Frankfurt would appear then to have no sense of gratitude for past donations that had been made to the city. It also did not help in their minds that New York banks, such as the one that was connected to Jakob Schiff, had strong connections with American press outlets. Because of all this, Krebs dashed off a letter in early 1934 to Bengen in which he simply stated that there would be no name changes to Jakob Schiff-Strasse or other Jewish street names because of quote-unquote special circumstances. The issue of Jewish street names, though, resurfaced later in 1934 in September when there was a complaint about another Jewish street name, Hochschildstrasse. And in this new conversation about what to do with these streets, a whole new set of dilemmas presented themselves to the members of the street naming committee. For one, most of the members thought it would be too extreme if they were to follow the actions of city governments in places such as Nuremberg and Munich that had decided to rid their cities of all of their Jewish street names. Another suggestion that would have had streets revert to their old names was deemed inadvisable because this would bring back names such as Judengasse, Jew Street in English, or Judenmarkt, Jew Market, back into very prominent locations within the center of the city. So the consensus then was that this is something that would not, in fact, rid the downtown, the heart of the city, of Jewish street names, sort of rendering this program a bit useless. They also added that they were worried about the fact that this might be seen as an action that would be discourteous to Christian residents of these particular streets. The provisional solutions, though, that they came to were twofold. The first of these was that they were going to order local cells of the Nazi Party to gather more information on existing Jewish street names in the cities. They would have more systematic information with which they could work. The second decision was that they were going to prioritize changing streets that were named after Jews that, in their opinion, had engaged in quote-unquote anti-German activities. This foretold the inevitable end of Jakob Schiff-Strasse because a Nazi magazine had dubiously claimed around this time that Schiff, an investment banker, a prototypical capitalist, but a Jewish investment banker and Jewish prototypical capitalist nonetheless, had been one of the foremost bankrollers of the Bolsheviks during the Russian Revolution. More complications arose almost as soon as these decisions were made. First, officials at the city's Office of Statistics said that the final draft of the city's 1935 address book had already been sent to press. Last-minute revisions would result in the city incurring a hefty printing fine, as well as potentially sow confusion in the local population trying to navigate the streets of the city. Another issue is that, ironically, most of Frankfurt's Nazi Party cells actually failed to identify the Jewish street names that were, in fact, in their midst. A cell that was located in Eschersheim, for example, said that they had no Jewish street names in their district, overlooking the very presence of Jakob Schiff-Strasse under their very noses. Another cell said that although Hallgartenstrasse was named for a philanthropist who had a foreign first name, both things that made someone quite suspicious of being associated with Jewishness, they could not, for a fact, declare whether or not Charles Hallgarten was Jewish, and more research was needed. Aside from these issues, though, there was a sense that was coming up during this period with members of the Committee on Street Names and other officials in the city government that it would simply be wrong for the city to completely rid Frankfurt of Jewish street names and thus deny the historical impact that Jews had made on Frankfurt and Germany. In November of 1934, Mayor Friedrich Krebs of the city himself said that he was, quote, fundamentally not in favor of a complete removal of all non-Aryan street names, that is, and that streets named after non-Aryans who have made contributions through charitable foundations or similar actions related to the general good, or who have played an outstanding role in the fields of art or science can remain in place, end quote. Otto Ruppersberg, another member of the Committee on Street Names, who is also the city's chief archivist, even suggested that they should create a new street that would bring back the Rothschild family name to the street grid, because in his mind, quote, it would be inappropriate for their name to completely disappear from the directory of streets, end quote. So this campaign finally started to gain some momentum in February of 1934, when members of this committee and other officials in the city government agreed to a plan on how they're going to address 54 streets named after Jews, liberals, socialists, and communists that were still in place in Frankfurt. So regarding the Jewish names on this list, 11 of them would immediately be renamed. 3 of them would disappear and not, in fact, be replaced. 9 would wait to be renamed until 1936, and 15 would, in fact, remain into the foreseeable future. And there were a couple of different reasons for leaving these latter 15 names in place. On a pragmatic level, the city address book would henceforth say, for example, that 3 streets that were named after female members of the Rothschild family, so we have Luisenstrasse, Sophienstrasse, as well as Mathildenstrasse, these would no longer be listed as being named after members of the Rothschild family. Rather, they would say in the address book that they were simply named after popular female first names. Beyond this, though, the committee still said that most of the other names should remain in place because their namesakes had substantially impacted local, German, or even world culture. I have 2 examples right here on the slide. The first one is of a street that was named after Paul Ehrlich, who was a Nobel laureate in chemistry because of his work creating the anti-syphilitic drug Salvarsan. According to members of the committee, the world still saw this as, quote, a success of German science, and it would be a problem if they decided to rid the city of this street name. For other reasons, though, the committee also voted to keep a street that was named after Felix Mendelssohn, the composer. And this is because in their minds, quote, this composer who had converted to Christianity as a child had never acted in a specifically Jewish manner, end quote. This was unlike, say, the poet Heinrich Heine, another famous convert whose name was memorialized on the street grid of the city. So moving forward, most of the committee's new plan proceeded without a problem, and some of the streets that were slated to be renamed in 1936 were actually changed at an earlier date. That being said, though, I have found 2 cases, at least, in which there was minor opposition to some of the proposals for changing Jewish street names in the city. I want to talk about them briefly. The first comes from the summer of 1935, when a group of employees that worked in the city forest office begged officials in the city not to rename a horse riding path in the city forest that was named after a Jewish philanthropist by the name of Gustav Gerst. Gerst had made many generous donations to the city over the years. Chief among them, you can see in this photograph right here, is the Goethe Turm, the Goethe Tower. This is a large wooden tower that is hopefully being reconstructed right now. It burned down a couple years ago in Frankfurt. But this was a tower that was built to allow people to sort of reflect on the works of this great poet in nature. And when they were writing about their opposition to changing the name of this riding path, the officials that were at the city forest office stressed the fact that Gerst had made only 2 simple conditions when he donated the money to build this tower. The first was the fact that this tower would have to be free to all Frankfurters, regardless of class, and would never charge any admission fees. And the second reason was that he said that he only wanted to be referred to as a so-called anonymous donor on this project into the future, that he never wanted his name to officially be connected with it. He wanted to remain anonymous. This effort, though, fell upon deaf ears, and Gerstweg, as the street was called, was gone within the year. In another instance, though, the dean of the local university's medical school and his colleagues were asked to think of a local scientist whose name could be used as a replacement for Paul Ehrlich's on Paul Ehrlichstrasse, which was actually right next to the site of Frankfurt's main university hospital. Reflecting on this, several faculty members said it would be simply impossible to think of another Frankfurter who had impacted the world as much as Ehrlich had. And the director of the Institute of Animal Physiology fretted that, quote, Ehrlich was such an outstanding person. Frankfurt and all of Germany are so indebted to him that many Germans and foreigners would not be able to comprehend a name change to that street. End quote. The city government seemed to agree on this matter, and Paul-Ehrlich-Strasse was able to remain in place. So in a sense then, despite these changes to many of these street names, this campaign to fully Aryanize the street grid was losing steam, and only 4 Jewish street names changed in 1937. What I will say, though, is that there were other ways in which this earlier trace of Jewish street names still continued to be a part of everyday life in the city, even after they were seemingly abolished. So at this time, as well as up to this present day, it's a common practice in Germany that if there is a change to a street name, an old street sign will remain in place with some kind of a dash going through it. So even if we think about a change being made to some kind of a Jewish street during this period, this old name would remain in place, signaling that it had once memorialized some Jewish figure that was important for local, national, or global culture. In a similar fashion, the city's address book from this period also ended up preserving many of these old street names because they would list what the former names of new street names were. Example I cite right here comes from 1939, in which a street that was changed to be named after Ferdinand Runge was listed as formerly being named after Karl Weinberg, a Jewish industrialist and philanthropist in the city. So this map right here shows you the location of the 9 remaining Jewish street names as of the start of 1938 up until June of that year. And it looked at this point as if the city government did not have any plans to, in fact, get rid of these few remaining streets. Things started to set a bit more in motion during the summer. So in July, the street that had been named for Felix Mendelssohn was changed to be named after Joseph Haydn. This was to honor Germany's recent annexation of Austria. But the final push to rename all of Frankfurt's Jewish street names came from Berlin rather than from the municipal government of Frankfurt itself. This happened when the Prussian Interior Ministry issued an order in August in which they said that all German cities would need to rid themselves of Jewish street names by no later than October 1st of 1938. The city complied with this quite quickly, and as of September 24th of 1938, got rid of 7 of the 8 remaining Jewish street names. I said 7 of 8. There was one lone survivor that never disappeared during the course of the Third Reich, a very small street in the western part of the city named after the philanthropist Albert Linnell. I've talked a lot so far in this talk about sort of the bureaucratic side of what's going on right here. I want to take a minute or so right here to talk about how Jews themselves in Frankfurt were reacting to these changes that were going on around them, because these Jewish street names were a major source of local pride for the Jewish community before 1933. I found several articles in local Jewish newspapers to this effect. And when the name changes started in the early period of Nazi rule, this was a subject not just in the local Jewish press, but also in the national Jewish press in Germany as well. Turning to individual experiences, the changes going on with these names could in some ways, in fact, serve as a kind of barometer for ongoing Nazi efforts to roll back integration. The one example I'm thinking of is that there was a doctor, Simon Isaac, who wrote about the fact that every day when he was walking to and from his house to work, he made a point of looking up at the street signs to see whether or not streets named after Paul Ehrlich or named after Felix Mendelssohn had in fact disappeared or been changed overnight. And in one final case I'm going to bring up as an example right here from 1938, a woman by the name of Mila Brock was in fact caught unawares by the fact that Paul-Ehrlich-Strasse had changed. She'd written a letter to a relative of hers that was living on that street, only to have a postman gruffly return the letter and say that the street was no longer named Paul-Ehrlich-Strasse because, quote, Paul Ehrlich was a Jew. Her reaction, she writes, is that, quote, for a moment I thought, should I enlighten him and tell him about the Nobel Prize winner Paul Ehrlich, who discovered cell arson and thus saved the lives of thousands who suffered from syphilis, end quote. In the end, though, she remained silent. So back to the first of these 2 questions that I posed at the start of this talk. How is it that this campaign to get rid of these street names took so long? How is it that these Jewish street names were able to remain in the street grid of Frankfurt for such a long period when other elements of Jewish integration had already been curtailed or even disappeared? I want to offer up a couple of potential answers right here. The first of which is bureaucratic inefficiency. This is a case that, as I was saying before, should have been a kind of slam dunk for the city government. Once they knew which streets need to be renamed, there was really quite little from a legal standpoint that was standing in their way. Instead, there were numerous delays as local Nazi party cells struggled to identify Jewish street names, as members of the government fretted about added costs or confusion in the local population, and as other disagreements arose between members of the committee on street names or other parts of the city government. A second reason I'll mention right here is a fear of financial retribution. Some of these street names, as I was saying before, were tied to donations, and officials worried that this would cause them to either have to return money or would make them subject to attacks in the foreign press that would hurt the prestige of Germany. I'll add that Frankfurt was a city that had been thriving on international trade since the Middle Ages. It makes sense that a financial concern might take precedence in this situation. By that same token, though, what I will add too is that this speaks to a growing influence of anti-Semitic notions about Jewish global financial power in Germany during this period. A third reason, national power versus local power. This is something that remained a local issue up until 1938. Frankfurt still had a large degree of independence about how they were going to sort out the issue with these streets. It was only once the Prussian government intervened in the summer of 1938 that a final change to almost all these Jewish street names took place. And a final potential answer here, and I think most curiously, numerous officials in Frankfurt's government and even figures from what might have once resembled civil society felt that it simply was not right to stop honoring or even to deny the contributions that certain Jews had made to Frankfurt and Germany's history and culture. Because of the strength of this memory, certain Jewish street names that were spatial indicators of Jewish integration and past belonging tenaciously remained in place for a few years after 1933. Which takes me back to the second question that I mentioned at the start. What do street names tell us about minority integration on a historical as well as on a contemporary level? So back around the time that I started writing the paper that is the basis for this talk that I'm giving today, I came across a really great project from the German periodical Die Zeit on their website that was all about street names in Germany. And the authors in this project really trenchantly write that, quote, street names are stories of life. They tell us something about how the people in a given place work and live, what they believe in and their dreams. They also shed light on the things we like to remember and what we would prefer to forget. It should hopefully come as no surprise then that there's a real connection, I think, between street names and America's ongoing reckoning with its racist past and present. I'll cite two examples right now. The first is the fact that whenever I go to visit my in-laws in Virginia, I am reminded of the very sad fact that most of US Route 1 is called Jefferson Davis Highway in the state of Virginia. A more common sight is the presence of over 900 streets named after Martin Luther King Jr. While these streets are seemingly ever present in the country, the writer Deirdre Mask, the comedian Chris Rock, as well as the rapper Killer Mike, have all pointed out the fact that government officials have often placed these streets honoring a slain civil rights leader in majority Black neighborhoods that have suffered or been subjected to decades of urban blight, perhaps obscuring, I would argue, the message of integration and reconciliation that these street names are supposed to impart. Which brings me, in closing, to the present moment. In a year that's been filled with protests and social unrest related to the slaying of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many other Black Americans at the hands of police, politicians and grassroots activists and anti-racist activists have already started to reimagine how street names and other urban spaces can be used as a continued part of efforts to create a more just and equitable society here in the United States of America. Just one example I'll talk about very quickly is the creation in June of Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C. This is a case in which we see a call for racial justice and police reform in the form of a street name being placed right in the heart of a city that's designed to physically represent American democracy. I'll chasten to add here as well, thinking back on what I was talking about a few minutes ago, that this is yet another case in which we see a renaming of a square that's related to the dynamics of an ongoing conflict between local power, in this case in the form of the DC municipal government, and national power in the form of the Trump administration in the aftermath of protesters being cleared from Lafayette Square Park.
So to close, I'll say this. As we look to the future, it's my sincere hope that the act of naming and renaming streets will continue to, and might yet play an even more important role in America's much needed reckoning with its own past and present. Thank you so much. Happy to answer your questions.